Throughout human history, philosophers have pondered what exactly consciousness is. Now, what if I told you someone figured it out?
Do you think you are one of the smartest people on the planet?
Yes. I'm far enough off the curve that you could consider me a kind of anomaly, I guess. But certain people are going to crop up with who have the kind of thought ability. I don't know whether it's discipline or whether it's just sheer raw brilliance that creates someone like me. I think no combination of determinacy and randomness can actually explain intelligence. Therefore, something more is required, a higher language. And that higher language would, by definition, be metaphysical.
Right, I think I'm understanding about as much of that as the horses at this moment in time.
Hey, you shush.
Okay, now who even is this muscular guy, and why is he talking to that horse? This man is Chris Langan, and he reportedly has the highest IQ in America, and possibly the world.
I was working in a bar at night, and I happened to see a copy of Omni magazine. It said, the world's most difficult IQ test. It consists of 48 problems, some of which are extremely difficult. I think, gee, that's interesting. You know, that's interesting. I always wanted to know what my IQ was. The verbal problems were all pretty easy, so I just breezed through them. I happen to have a larger than average vocabulary. The really difficult ones were some of the spatial problems and the number sequences. Actually, highly difficult. So as it turned out, I ended up setting a record score on that test. My IQ would be somewhere between 190 and 210.
210 seems very, very, very high.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
What about you? How many of these questions could you solve? Try this one. Teeth is to hen, as nest is to...
Man, this some old bullshit.
Yeah, you see, these questions are difficult. Even if you don't believe me, or Chris, about his IQ, we can at least hear what Chris has to say about consciousness.
Cognitive-theoretic model of the universe, the CTMU. It shows that we're all a part of the same universal self. All men are related in ways they can't necessarily discern on this plane of reality. We're all the same. We all share a basic fundamental identity with each other.
The cognitive-theoretic model of the universe, aka the CTMU, is Langan's intellectual baby he has cared for and developed for at least the past 30 years. The CTMU is a metaphysical theory which intends to describe, among other things, reality's ultimate identity and the place consciousness has in relation to that identity.
Let's start from what's most fundamental and then how you work your way up from there to derive your theory.
Okay, well, the theory is developed by a means called logical induction. You start with, you've heard of Descartes, cogito ergo sum, right? Cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. And you've heard of Berkeley's esse est percipi, okay, which is basically to be is to be perceived or to perceive, right? You start with perception and cognition. Then you develop the minimal model of how cognition and perception work. Then you induce an overall system that works by those processes. Okay, and that's the way you get to the CTMU.
Induction, or inductive reasoning, infers general statements from a set of specific initial ingredients. Here, logical induction will attempt to infer general truths about reality's identity from a set of specific truths which are obvious. Namely, these are cogito ergo sum and esse est percipi. From these statements, we know one thing is certain. At least one conscious experience exists, and something is experiencing it. You, sitting right there watching my video, your conscious experience exists, and you cannot try to deny it without affirming it. Additionally, you're always experiencing something. It's a tautology, or absolutely true. Since the conscious experience exists, it has some sort of ontological identity, and by acknowledging it has an ontological identity, we have now identified it, at least to some general degree. It exists is a very general identification, but it is still an accurate identification nonetheless. Now, identification of any sort implies the identity is non-contradictory and adheres to logic, at least in some way. Take, for example, an apple. If you have normal sight, you'll be able to experience the qualia of the apple's appearance. Now, because the experience exists, it is certainly one thing and not another. For example, the experience has the property of existence, which necessarily distinguishes it from non-existence. This distinction is an instantiation of the law of non-contradiction. You could also frame it as an instantiation of the law of identity or the law of excluded middle. Either way, it is an adherence to logic. Either A or not A is true. A and not A is never true. Here, in this void, to paint a better picture, the qualia associated with the apple either exists or it does not exist. While you're identifying it, it does not simultaneously exist and not exist at the same time. You are experiencing it, so it must exist. And this applies to all experiences. There exists a general level of non-contradiction which makes the experience identifiable.
Are you seeing me right now through that monitor in front of you? The answer is yes or no, and if you can't choose, you can't perceive me. You don't know whether I'm here or not. 1 or 0, yes or no. Binary logic is something you depend on. Without it, you can't have so much as a single perception. If we can base insight to God on binary logic, we've got it made.
If 1 or 0, A or not A, is not decided, then you won't be able to identify your conscious experience. Whenever identification occurs, A or not A has already been decided. Something has been ontologically distinguished from something else. And non-contradiction has been enforced. But how does that happen? Your conscious experience and all of that qualia has the property of existence. We'll call this property E. You, the experiencer, also exist and have the property E. For the sake of the video, this property will also include non-contradiction. As we just said, 1 or 0, A or not A, E or not E, has to be decided before identification occurs. In this diagram, S is just the underlying medium containing A and not A. S can be understood as a self-contained medium, which is the most fundamental of all mediums. If you were to assume some medium existed outside S, then the medium containing both can just be redefined as S until we arrive at a medium which relies on no external medium. But isn't this an unending process or infinite regress of digging to deeper mediums? Well, some structure, or medium, would have to allow that process to exist ad infinitum, right? Well, there's your most fundamental medium. Since this fundamental medium relies on nothing external to itself to support itself, then any mappings on it will have their domain inside the medium. And by virtue of the medium's self-containment, any mapping on it will also have its codomain inside the medium. Otherwise, we have not identified the most fundamental medium. Therefore, any mapping is from S to itself. The attribution of property E can be understood as a mapping called mu. Some part of S, or S in its entirety, is going to be the domain of the mapping. Mu functions to apply property E to some stuff in S and not to other stuff in S. The result is the codomain of the mapping, which, at the very least, has a subset in S that you are able to directly know as the set A. The rest of the codomain is everything which has the property E, at least as a bare minimum. So S effectively attributes to itself the property E through the mapping mu. And since E is instantiated by mu, then S self-actualizes itself to match the generic form determined by mu. This generic form is, minimally, that of non-contradiction and identification of an ontological identity which can be unequivocally known through a subjective, conscious experience. The experiencer and all that is experienced is an image of mu. When I say S self-actualizes, I mean that S determines for itself what becomes actualized and what does not. It self-determines. It determines itself. Since S's definition cannot rely on anything external to itself, then it must be self-definitive in a very general sense. We'll call the property corresponding to this C. C is an intrinsic property for S. Otherwise, S would be without any definition. Therefore, C is characteristic of S. For any medium, the characteristic or defining properties of that medium distribute to everything inside of itself. If something inside the medium did not have the defining properties of the medium, it necessarily would not be part of the medium. For example, if something did not have the defining properties of the medium of space, then it would not be part of space. A clear example of this would be something like time. Time doesn't have the quote-unquote spaceness that matter does. Since S is defined by C, then everything inside S must also have C, which, for reference again, is self-determinacy. Otherwise, that part of S would not be an S. The consequence of this is that everything within S inherits the very general kind of self-determinacy utilized by S. So that means the experiencer and everything which is experienced inherits self-determinacy to some degree. To define or determine itself, S must refer to itself in some way. Another way to say this is like this. In order to determine itself, it must be aware of what it is it's determining. S must be able to register what it is trying to determine. A concrete example would be human self-actualization. You cannot consciously choose the version of yourself that you want to become unless you are aware of all of the list of options. By generating the list of options and referring to them, you are becoming aware of yourself. Reference can be considered a generalization of awareness. By referencing itself, S has a very generic form of awareness. It's different from the kind of awareness humans have, but both are similar in that they both have self-reference or self-awareness capacities. Since this generic self-awareness is intrinsic to how S self-determines, then notice that everything in the medium inherits it in general form. So electrons, plants, animals, bacteria, and humans all share a very generic form of consciousness which they inherit from S, which you can consider to be ultimate reality. It's important to emphasize again that this consciousness is not the same as human consciousness.
I haven't gotten to any questions on consciousness, but in your theory, how is consciousness defined and where does it fit in?
Every quantum of the universe is conscious because it's a syntactor. A syntactor is a generalization of a computational acceptor. It's a proto-computational generalization of what in computation theory is called an acceptor.
Recognition is synonymous with the computational notion of acceptance by acceptors. Acceptors are mathematically defined automata that read input and output a 1 or 0, depending on whether or not that input is accepted. Essentially, 1 or 0 is decided, A or not A, E or not E. Sound familiar? The input read by an acceptor is labeled as the language, which is read by the acceptor. If you ever hear Langen talking about languages within the context of the CTMU, he's referring to this notion of a language. It's much more general than standard natural languages, and it's known as a formal language. Anyways, back to acceptors. At the largest scale, S is what decides E or not E. This 1 or 0 determination, which is performed by acceptors, is also what S does. Another angle is that when S exercises its self-determinacy to define itself, it is answering the 1 or 0 question and referencing itself for its own input. However, it does this in a proto-computational way, since S transcends the space-time bounds which define what we normally call computation. Thus, the self-identification of S likens it to a proto-computational acceptor, and following the inheritance rule we laid earlier, everything else is a generic proto-computational acceptor which acts to be aware and recognize its surroundings. In the CTMU, these proto-computational acceptors are called syntactors. Specific syntactors will have specific languages which determine what exactly the syntactor will accept or recognize. What's it like to be a bat, or human, or a blind person, or a fly? These specific syntactors will have specific languages that they read or recognize, so each one will probably recognize things differently, and that's kind of what we would expect. In conclusion, consciousness, relying on recognition and awareness, is something inherited by everything inside ultimate reality. It presents as an identification operation, or recognition function, which is synonymous with the processes of a proto-computational acceptor. And just to clarify, I'm not a CTMU expert. I've been studying the CTMU for the past 4 years, and I still feel like there's so much more to know. So I won't say I've gotten everything right, but I hope I still did a good job. Thanks.